Welcome to today's webinar on the CSBG Annual Report. Today we will cover both modules, one on state administration and module 2 on the agency expenditures, capacity, and resources. For those of you who may not know me, I am Jackie Orr, the State Assistance Director at NASCSP. Along with myself, there will be other presenters on the webinar today, and you will see them on your screen. We will have Seth Hassett, who's the Director at the Division of State Assistance at the Office of Community Services, and also Rae Tamblyn, the Research and Communications Analyst at NASCSP, along with Lauren Cook, the CSBG Team Lead at NASCSP. Also with us today is Barbara Mooney, the Director of the Association of Nationally Certified ROMA Trainers, and Kate Blunt of the Federal Consulting Group. But before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items with all of you. All of you are on mute. If you have questions during the webinar, you can ask them using the chat option on the webinar toolbar. Now, the toolbar is on the right-hand side of your screen, and you'll see a text box where you can type a question. Make sure you select all panelists so that all of the presenters can see your questions during the webinar. Questions will be read aloud and answered during the question and answer portion at the end of the webinar. In order to keep to our schedule, if we don't have time for all the questions, we will make sure we will compile your questions into a frequently asked questions document, and then we will post that on the NASCSP website. As you probably already do know, this webinar is being recorded and will also be posted to the NASCSP website, if not by tomorrow, then early next week. And I think that's all of our housekeeping items for now. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kate Blunt to get us started on today's presentation.
Thank you, Jackie. Good afternoon, everyone. As Jackie mentioned, today we're going to focus on Module 1 and 2. This is the last of a 5-part webinar series. All the other 4 parts are now on the NASCSP website for you to view at your leisure. I think you will find all of them informative, so hopefully you will have some time, if you have not sat in on any of the others, to review those. We've had several objectives for this webinar series, and I'd like to review those again. We want everyone in the network to understand what ROMA Next Generation is all about and the role that the CSBG Annual Report plays. The Annual Report is part of ROMA Next Generation, but it is not all of what ROMA Next Generation is about. We want you to understand the specifics of what is being proposed in the new Annual Report, and we want you to learn what is needed from you during the 60-day comment period. We do need your thinking and your expertise to help us make this the best annual report we can have. As we have 2 modules to cover today, we're going to have somewhat less focus on the whole ROMA Next Generation. We'll cover some of it, but you'll find more in-depth discussion of that on the other webinars, so do go and listen to those. So for today's agenda, we will talk a bit about ROMA Next Generation and continuous improvement. Seth is going to walk us through Module 1, the state administration, how this aligns with the state plan, and give you an overview of the different sections. After Module 1, we will be asking you to submit questions, give you a few minutes to do that, but we won't answer the questions till the end, but we want you to be able to give us your questions after Module 1. Then we'll talk about Module 2, which is the agency expenditures, capacity, and resources. We will talk about how the annual report, what we're thinking about in terms of phasing it in, what the current status of the annual report is in terms of the comment period, what's needed now and next steps, and then we will have plenty of time for questions and answers, so please do submit those. So with that, let me turn it over to Seth to walk us through ROMA Next Generation and a bit of an overview of that. Seth? Okay,
thanks, Kate. And just the first thing we'll share is that we're just going to highlight that this, the 60-day clearance process we are entering, it relates to a draft annual report, and that annual report has 4 modules. As we've shared in prior webinars, The first module, which we're discussing today on state administration, this is completed only by the state CSBG lead agency, but I would emphasize that everyone has a stake in the information that's shared here, so it's of interest to not only to state CSBG agencies, but to all participants in the CSBG network. The second, third, and fourth modules are all completed by local CSBG eligible entities, generally community action agencies. These are going to be on a different timeline than the first module, but the whole package is part of a revised annual report that is all part of a enhanced performance management framework for CSBG. We just want to highlight as we begin our conversation about ROMA Next Generation, just to remind that ROMA Next Generation builds upon other elements of this performance management framework, including new organizational standards and state and federal accountability measures, all designed to help achieve the full potential of the CSBG network. Just to head to the next slide, just to emphasize that the performance management framework is really focused on two large questions that we want to be addressing across the CSBG network. On the left-hand side, these are the questions about how well the network operates. And on the right-hand side, what is the difference that the network has made? So the building blocks for how well we're operating include, of course, the local organizational standards, the state and federal accountability measures, and a ROMA system. And just to highlight, for those of you that want to find out more and are not deeply familiar with the local org standards, Information Memoranda 138 was published in January of 2015. That's available on our OCS website. And for those of you who are not familiar with the state and federal accountability measures, Information Memoranda 144 was published on October of 2015. And these really talk in depth about what we're trying to achieve. And again, this is all about understanding the capacity and accountability at all levels of the network. And then, of course, on the right-hand side, the results of the work are documented in our national performance indicators for families and communities. So just to emphasize, our overall focus in ROMA Next Generation is on integrating information on the people served, the services and strategies provided, and the outcomes achieved by eligible entities. This is envisioned as a system for continuous quality improvement, and our overall hope is to create learning organizations at all levels of the CSBG network. And this means, of course, it requires attention to the capacity at both the state and local data system level in terms of the capacity to do the analysis and provide the support. ROMA Next Generation builds on the results-oriented management and accountability system that was originally created in response to the Government Performance and Results Act, or GPRA. In 1993, GPRA was tasked to require federal programs to engage in performance management activities such as setting performance goals, measuring results, and reporting progress. And it launched a performance management wave in the public and private sector that resulted in reporting of results externally to funders and other stakeholders. In 2010, the GPRA Modernization Act set new expectations for federal agencies agencies and leaders to set clear and ambitious goals, to measure, analyze, and communicate performance information, to identify successful practices that can be disseminated, as well as problematic practices that need to be prevented or corrected. And most importantly, it called on federal agencies to frequently conduct in-depth performance reviews to drive progress on agency priorities. This next slide, this is a quote that comes from the President's Executive Order in 2011 related to GPRA modernization. And I think it's worth reviewing one more time. And it just says that our goal is to create a performance management framework that encourages good management and innovation without fear of penalty for failing to achieve every ambitious target that has been set. but with heightened pressure to achieve breakthrough gains and on priorities. So GIPR modernization reflects the most recent wave in performance management, and it calls for focusing and analyzing data on results and using information to improve programs rather than merely reporting to outside stakeholders. Now, Kate Blunt is going to walk us through some background related to the state administration module, and then I will be discussing some of the content in more detail.
We want to make sure that you all have the context of how this module aligns with the state plan. Because obviously the states have submitted a state plan this year, the 2016, back in September, and they'll be reporting on their results come next March. So there is a clear alignment, and we want to make sure that that is clear. So let me kind of walk through a few slides to explain that. Module 1 of the annual report details what was actually achieved by the state against what you planned. So you laid out in your annual state plan some ideas, some thoughts, some initiatives, things along specific categories of what you plan to do over the coming year. The annual report, you'll be able to tell us what, in fact, you did do, including how you did on the accountability measures. It is the place, the annual report, for the state CSBG lead agency to tell its story. And it is the place where the state CSBG agency provides its analysis of what was accomplished in the state. So the annual report is taking on much more significance in terms of being a vehicle for really being able to tell our story. OCS had put together a few months ago a state administration work group to review the draft module and to give us some recommendations and make some revisions. That group included Verna Beth from North Carolina, Tamara Kohler from Utah, Tiki Brown from Minnesota, Samia Britt from California, Beverly Buchanan from Arkansas, and Emily Higgins from Vermont. They were very helpful in helping us refine and make this a better module, and we want to thank them for their participation and efforts on that. Other points in terms of the alignment with the state plan. There are 9 sections in the annual report. A through I will be walking through those. As Seth mentioned, he will walk us through that. They parallel the state plan format. So this shouldn't be new. This will be very familiar to you, to those of you that had to fill out the state plan. We expect that this will be implemented, as Seth mentioned. Module 1 is on a different schedule than the rest of the modules. This will be implemented for the fiscal year 2016 annual report, which is due next March 2017, except for one section which we will highlight. B7, which is more of the analysis, will be something that will be delayed because it is based on the other modules. As you did with the state plan, we will be using OLDC, and there will be many items that will be auto-populated features, as was done with the state plan, and some features, information will be transferred from the state plan into the annual report. So we're trying to make this as streamlined and efficient as possible. Another key thing to remember in terms of alignment with the state plan, the annual report does track performance on the state accountability measures. And you'll recall the state accountability measures fall into 2 big buckets. First bucket is development of the state plan, and the second bucket has to do with implementation of the state plan. And there are 7 parts under that: how you distribute funds, how you use discretionary funds, your grant monitoring, your data collection, the org standards, your linkages, and then the eligible entity satisfaction score. So in your state plan, you laid out very much specifics about each of those categories. And then in the annual report, you will give us some information about how you did on those. The other thing that the Module 1 does in terms of aligning with the state plan is it does include reporting on the ACSI survey results. So the states have all received their ACSI results, and in Module 1, you'll be able to report on that result. You'll be able to tell us how the state considered feedback from the eligible entities and other sources. You'll be able to tell us what actions you took as a result of the feedback that you got from the eligible entities and other sources. And then you'll project next year's target for that overall satisfaction of eligible entities. You will notice that there is some target setting and reporting of the ACSI in both the state plan and the annual report. This is deliberate. It does help us with those of you that have two-year plans. Plus, it will take into account in the future any time that the ACSI results might vary in terms of when they are reported. We're trying to aim that they get reported in the second quarter of the fiscal year, but that could change. So at least you have some place every year, either in the state plan or the annual report, to make that, to provide that information. OCS is planning on holding a webinar in the next couple of weeks about the ACSI and more in-depth information about how it relates to the state plan, how it relates to the annual report, how this ties together, and specifically how to set targets regarding the ACSI. It is somewhat different than what you might think in terms of target setting. So we are going to provide you another webinar, but we're going to give you a few days breathing because everybody's been doing a lot of webinars. But I think it'll be one you'll be interested in. So let me turn this back to Seth to go sort of section by section over the Module 1. Seth.
Okay, thank you, Kate. And just to reiterate, we did provide, there was a more detailed webinar walking through the content of this module. And I would encourage you, if you are interested in going through on a question-by-question basis, to do that. And just to emphasize again, the full text of the administrative module is distributed and available on the OCS website, and that this whole system is designed to link closely with the state CSBG plan. There are 9 sections to the administrative module. We are going to, there are 2 sections that we're not going to be discussing in any depth today, Section A and Section C, and really these are just information sections where we get listings of contact information, listings of the basic information on the eligible entities or the community action agencies that are funded through the CSBG network. What we want to focus mostly on today is sections where we think we really need and encourage input from during the 60-day comment period. And so to begin, we'll talk about Section B, which is where we talk about, and really this is a critical section, about statewide goals and accomplishments. In the state plan, each state was requested to provide goals for their administration of CSBG. And in many cases, these are, again, administrative goals, not so much outcome goals or results goals, but what the state hoped to achieve in its overall administration of CSBG. And the design here is that in the annual report, states would have be asked to report on whether the goals were accomplished, partially accomplished or not, and the opportunity to provide additional explanation and discussion. So the next question, as Kate mentioned, is one that I think is really new and an area that we expect to provide a lot of additional guidance in the next few weeks. This focuses on the results of the, as Kate mentioned, the American Customer Satisfaction Index, or ACSI survey score. This is something where we're asking for a target in terms of the state's plans for target for the next year or for the next overall survey. And I will say, again, we plan to put out an information memoranda that sort of describes what are some of the realistic targets and how to set targets based on the methodology and experience with ACSI, and also some additional guidance will be provided in a recorded webinar. A follow-on to that question is question B3, which is about where the state would provide feedback in terms of discuss how eligible entity feedback and involvement have been incorporated during as a result of the ACSI survey and other feedback or information the state received. Then questions B4 through B6 have to do with narrative descriptions of state management accomplishments, eligible entity management accomplishments, and innovative solution highlights. Just to highlight that all three of these questions are almost verbatim items that have been previously included in the CSBG IS, or Information Survey, that was administered by NASCSP. We do still welcome your input and comments on whether these are framed correctly, if they and any input you have about the utility of these questions. But the general idea is to get feedback and hear about more from a management standpoint and pulling out some innovative practices that can be highlighted and that we might be able to highlight in our reports to Congress or other activities. I want to talk a little bit more depth about a particular question, B7, which is labeled summary analysis in the annual administrative report. And just to first frame up, because this is new to almost everybody who's will be reviewing this, it really even came in late in the process after the state working group had provided early input. And so we really want input about how this is framed, and are we getting at it in a way that's going to be useful, feasible, and doable. The purpose of Section B7, summary analysis, is to promote a conversation between states and CAAs about where local agencies are using data to make changes, what the local agencies have learned from their results, what improvements agencies have made, and what we can do as a network to share best practices. What are the practices that might be highlighted? And again, for the state to have that conversation with the community action agency, and then to look for practices that could be highlighted, of course, in the annual report, the state's annual report, and what we can do at all levels to help the local agencies. And then the overall goal here is just to promote a culture of analysis of key results. So we know this is going to take a lot of additional technical assistance and training, but let's walk through what some of the kinds of questions that we currently have as under B7 summary analysis. And these are really examples of key questions to be discussed. First is, what major changes have taken place in the CSBG network? Either new eligible entities, mergers, other changes, and again, generally administrative type of information, but what has changed in terms of the network that the state administers? What new partnerships were implemented in the state or in local level to improve administration or leverage resources or improve services? Other questions focus on what domains did eligible entities have the greatest impact in the state, based on the state's analysis of data. How well did the state and eligible entities do in meeting the needs of individuals and families and communities compared to the targets they set? And in what areas were eligible entities most successful in meeting their targets, and where did they experience challenges? Other areas of interest would be any demographic shifts, notable demographic shifts from prior years. How did outcomes differ from prior years? Were there key trends? And then looking at practices that were identified to share across the state, kind of a best practice type of information, and what changes the state might encourage or support with local eligible entities. So just to highlight on this, as you think about how to provide input, we know there's a lot in this, and we know that there are different current capacity either in the state or the community level in terms of providing this information. But looking at it, we would just encourage you to identify perhaps what are the most important questions you think should be answered in the terms of the analysis. And we've encouraged you to look at perhaps the three most important questions just to help us identify where people think what's most important. And if there's anything you would either add, subtract, or modify. So that gets us through Section B, and again, that's a critical section and one where we really encourage your input and look forward to a robust discussion. Section D, we're going to skip past, again, Section C, because that really is just primarily, unless there is a change in the eligible entities in a state, much of that will actually auto-populate from the state plan, but it's still, we're looking for any changes that have occurred. Section D, organizational standards, and again, this is most of these questions relate directly to a question that was asked in the state CSBG plan, but they talk about any changes in terms of how the state assessed organizational standards, what was the actual performance in terms of how many entities met all state adopted organizational standards, whether technical assistance plans or QIPs were put in place for all eligible entities with unmet organizational standards, which is question D3. And that's again, these are a follow-on to a series of questions that were asked in the state plan, but it's a way of us now, and it ties into both supporting the organizational standard system and state and accountability measures in terms of the work to make sure that entities do meet all state established standards. We're going to go then now and just, again, briefly review Section D, Section E, which focuses on the state use of funds. And this is really, I think, going to be an important transparency element in the annual report. Again, it does also relate to the CSBG plan, but we formulated this in such a way that during the time, of course, of creating a CSBG plan, a challenge is that generally, typically, states do not yet know their full allocation for the year or what Congress will appropriate and what their actual allocation amount will be. So many elements of the state plan are estimates, are percentages in terms of expected dollars and expected percentages to be spent in terms of particular areas as required under CSBG Act. The annual report, there will be more concrete information on how funds were at least obligated in each of these categories. And so we're actually going to be looking for actual dollar amounts as opposed to percentages or estimates. And just highlighting, these have to do with the state distribution formula, revisiting that. Were there any changes? What was the planned versus actual allocation of funds to the local eligible entities? What was the actual distribution time frame of funding? This relates to an accountability measure on the timeliness of state release of funds. What amount of funds did the state expend for its administrative activities during the reporting period? And how many other elements that relate to staff positions funded in whole and part in the state level, the number of FTEs funded with under the state plan under question E6, and how the state used its remainder or discretionary funds, the funds that are held at the state level to support training, technical assistance, or other kinds of needs allowable under CSBG, including evaluation or other kinds of support for the network. And question E8 relates to, this was what kinds of organizations received support under those remainder or discretionary funds. And there is a question about that in the state plan, but we're asking now for what kinds of actual organizations received the support. And all of this rolls up into a total obligations. And we do really encourage states particularly to look at question E9, the way this is presented. If you are not a financial expert, I certainly encourage you to talk with your budget office and others about whether this seems to ask the question in a way that you could answer. And if it isn't, or if it could be clarified, please let us know. We very much want this to be workable. But the idea here is that we would take what the state reports in terms of its obligations to the eligible entities, its administrative costs, its obligations for remainder discretionary funds. We would compare that to the prior year carryover and what's expected in terms of carryover for the next fiscal year. And then all of this would give us a rolling picture of the financial status, how much was actually spent or at least obligated during the reporting period for the grant. Moving on to Section F, Training and Technical Assistance. This is, again, an opportunity. We did ask in the state plan for information on expected areas of expenditure and activities in terms of training and technical assistance. So questions F1, F2 are tables, and we take what was actually provided in the state plan. It can be updated and then described in terms of the types of organizations and the types of training and CSBG funded training and technical assistance was actually provided to the eligible entities. Section G talks about state linkages and coordination, and these are a selected number of the assurances that were provided in the state plan, but where we're asking for a report out on terms of actual how things actually went, anything that changed in terms of linkage activities. Were there any new partners or activity work that were included in the linkages? And just we did not complete every assurance that was in the state plan, but certain key ones were included. And if you want to follow that in more detail, the prior webinar does discuss that item by item. And then moving to Section H, monitoring, corrective action, and fiscal controls. And I think this is something that everyone has a stake and interest in, and certainly is worth reviewing. It's something that I think eligible entities would have an interest in, as well as the state. So please do review this. This is there are tables that were included in the state plan to talk about the state's expected monitoring, whether they were going to be doing their full on-site monitoring, what agencies were expected to be monitored during the upcoming performance period, and all of that. Again, this is a report back with regard to the actual monitoring that was conducted, any changes, these can be added were there any changes in the monitoring policies. Again, a report out in terms of eligible entities that were on quality improvement plans and whether they were resolved on the schedule that was agreed upon. And there is a section which is related to the required state review of single audit results and any management decisions that were made as a result of the state audit, of the single audit results. So those are all, again, fairly detailed questions, very important for accountability purposes, but also very important that everybody understands them, and that if there are concerns about the level of detail or what's asked there, that to provide that. And the last section, Section I, is about the ROMA system. And this is not where the results are presented, but just for the state to describe. This is already, again, this will in many cases be almost unchanged from the state plan, but we'll be asking, auto-populating what the state described in terms of the ROMA system, how it was administered, what kinds of support was provided for it, and this is a chance to update that and describe how the state has administered its ROMA, its actual ROMA system. So that's the fast review, again, of the key sections and where we're seeking input from the administrative module. Again, what I'd like to encourage you to do, if you have, during the course of this presentation, this portion of the presentation, have questions, please enter them in the comment section now, and we will be doing our best to collect key questions and provide some responses, but we'll be doing that after the presentation about Module 2.
Before we get going on Module 2, we're going to give you a couple of minutes so you're not listening to us and you can actually think about the question. Give you a couple of minutes to type that into the chat section. So please ask us whatever question you want. We're going to try to, we have a good 20 minutes, we think, at the end to be able to answer a number of questions.
And now we're going to begin the presentation on Module 2, and I believe that Jackie will be framing up that section.
Yes, thank you, Seth and Kate. This is Jackie, and I have the pleasure of going over Module 2. So now we're going to take a look at the agency expenditures, capacity, and resources, which is what encompasses Module 2. So the purpose of Module 2 is helping us understand how CSBG is utilized, how it builds agency capacity, and what kinds of partnerships it supports. We know that how local agencies use CSBG funding is an important part of the community action story. Module 2 allows us to see the domain areas in which funding is expended, linking services with the needs identified in local community assessments. It allows us to demonstrate the unique responses of different agencies across the state and across the country, as well as I mentioned before, support the building and maintaining of agency capacity. So now we're going to take a look at the initial feedback period and what you told us. So first, what I'd like to do is take the opportunity to thank everyone for taking the time to provide comments and responses to the surveys back during the feedback period in March and April, if you remember that. We heard from about 50% of states and state associations and over 50% of community action agencies. Now, there were a number of ways that we received feedback from the network. You can see on your slide that this is the response to the surveys that folks responded to. You can see that for Survey 4, which is the module we're talking about today, Module 2, we received 553 responses. But we also received numerous letters and comments, and some of the comments were sent via email, and they were all extremely helpful. We reviewed all the comments, and that really helped us understand what modifications and clarifications that we needed to make. And so now we're going to take a look at some of the questions in the survey. So before we take a look at the specific survey, I did want to talk a little bit about, you'll see where it says weighted. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. And you may remember when doing the surveys that a state or association could respond on behalf of a number of entities. So we made sure that if a response was, say, for one state office, one community action association, and 18 community action agencies, that it was calculated not to show just one response, but to show all the responses. And so from this slide, you'll see that about 3/4 of the respondents rated very well or well that the domains for reporting allowed you to describe your expenditures for the CSBG, for your reaction to the domains for reporting CSBG expenditures. Now on the next slide, you'll see that we talk about agency capacity expenditures, and there were 3 specific questions. We asked you to tell us whether the list of credentials and certifications reflect staff qualifications that demonstrate agency capacity, and whether the identification of hours demonstrate your support for board members, staff, and volunteers. And you'll see from the percentages that about 2/3 of those who responded either rated it very well or for well. And then the last question in agency capacity expenditures was a list of activities and whether they identified your agency capacity building activities. And that was a little bit less positive rating at 58 or 59%, rated at 5 or 4. So then moving forward, the final question we're going to take a look at is reactions to the resources administered and generated by the CSBG network. We asked you how well the categories for recording allowed you to describe your resources, and approximately 71% responded either very well or well to this question. Now I'm going to turn it over to Barbara Mooney, who will talk a little bit about the key issues that were identified in this module.
Thank you, Jackie, and everyone has spoken before. In this section, we had very few issues that were identified. one of the things was that the CSBG expenditure categories that were proposed were worded differently from the other parts of the reports. So the domains that were identified in the national performance indicators at both the family and community level, in the services and strategies lists, were worded a bit differently, and so that was a confusion. In terms of the agency capacity, there were a couple of comments about additional credentials, specifically those that related to the production of weatherization services. It was noted that partnerships were being counted and identified in the community level strategies and the progress reports for the community level, but that there were other partnerships that were designed specifically to deliver services to individuals and families or to support the agency's capacity that were not included there. And so there were questions about where they could be captured. And then finally, in the resources administered by the CSBG network, all of those resources are monetary resources. They're all dollar amounts. And so there was some confusion about the inclusion of volunteer hours in this report because it was assumed that they would be calculated based on minimum wage, but the way volunteer hours are valued in different programs across the country are different. And so those were our issues. You'll see that those issues are all reflected in the 3 subsections in Module 2. The Section A, which is the local CSBG expenditure report, how local agencies expend their dollars, local capacity, and then their resources. So in the first one, in Section A, one clarification was the reporting period for the use of the CSBG expenditures. And so you'll see in the forms that'll be shown next, there's a place for the reporting period to be identified. We did realign the domains. We reworded them and assured that they matched the rest of the reporting sections. And the category for administration had been, it was proposed that it be included up in the total of the CSBG, the other expenditure categories, but you'll see that it has been moved into a separate line item as it has been in the past, as you will see is familiar to you. And the agency capacity report was revised in some ways. One of the ways that it was revised is that there were questions about money that might be spent on agency capacity for outside of CSBG. It was settled that the activities that are funded by CSBG be included here in the agency capacity expenditures report, and that there be a separate report on agency capacity identified that would have to do with hours of capacity building, training, and mentoring, and other sorts of capacity building activities, volunteer hours, and then the development and certification of staff, as well as agencies, or as well as partnerships, sorry. And in the local resources administered by the network, volunteer hours were removed from the resources and added into the agency capacity report so that it's more appropriate there. It's not a dollar amount. The report no longer calculates a monetary value since it's done differently. The hours is the one standard across the network. So I'm going to turn it over to Lauren now, who's going to talk about the report formats themselves.
Thank you, Barbara, and hello, everyone. Barbara has done a really nice job of walking through the changes that we've made to all of these forms. So before we actually walk through them and point out those changes, I just want to reiterate that many of the pieces in sections A, B, and C are not new. You'll see that some of the pieces are new, but the majority of this information on all of these forms is already being reported in the CSBGIS. The CSBG Expenditures form tells us the total amount of CSBG funding expended during the fiscal year for services, strategies, and now agency capacity. So this form aligns with Section E in the current CSBGIS. We want a way to explain how CSBG funding is being spent. We know this looks different at the local, state, and national level. So when the information entered here is rolled up to the national level, it really gives us a national picture of where CSBG funding is being focused. Now, since the initial comment period, we have revised the domains listed so that they align with the domains listed on the Services and Strategies report in Modules 3 and 4. So these revisions change the language but still meet the overarching purpose of the domains in the CSBG statute. For example, you'll see in Domain 7 listed here, nutrition is now included, or I'm sorry, Domain 5, nutrition is now included along with Domain 5, health, nutrition, and social behavioral development. I want to note that CSBG funding expended during the reporting period should be reported in the domain that best reflects the services delivered or strategies implemented. So you'll see where that arrow is pointing to Domain 7. We've added this, services supporting multiple domains, so that you have an opportunity to report services and strategies that may cover multiple domains listed here. So these might be case management, transportation, child care, those services that really support the multiple domains. So for example, it might be employment and education. If one of the services was directly related to only one of the domains, so maybe transportation related directly to employment, you would report that funding on the specific or appropriate domain line. I also want to point to Domain 8 listed here, Linkages. Linkages captures information about partnerships related to community-level efforts. These can be partnerships that serve a single or multiple domain. And then as Barbara mentioned before, we have pulled administration out of that larger Table 1 and pulled it below kind of as a separate subtable. If you're familiar with the current CSBGIS, you'll notice that this is very consistent with how you're already reporting funds expended for administration in Section E. And then we'll take a look at Table 2, which is still a part of Section A on local agency CSBG expenditures. Table 2 outlines details on agency capacity building funded by CSBG. So this is your opportunity to tell us about those activities, whether that's community needs assessment, strategic planning, the others listed there, or you have the space to enter activities that are not listed in this table already. And then looking at Section D on local agency capacity, we've already discussed a little bit that during the initial feedback period, we heard from you that there needed to be opportunity to report on agency capacity building that was funded not just by CSBG funding. Section D is a separate report now focused on agency capacity funded by CSBG and other funding sources, and it's comprised of 4 parts. So this really allows additional opportunity to report on all of your agency capacity efforts. Again, with this report, you'll see that many of the pieces look familiar to how they're already being reported in the CSBGIS. So if we first look at number 1, hours of agency capacity building, this is very similar to what you would now report in 5.1 on staff trainings and board trainings. Then looking at number 2, volunteer hours was included in the resources administered by the CSBG network during the initial feedback period. We heard very sound feedback that volunteer hours should not be reported there, and also that they should not have a monetary value assigned. as agencies calculate this in different ways. So based on this feedback, we've included this now in the agency capacity form, and this is still very similar to how you're reporting this in 2.3 and 3.1 in the CSBGIS. So you'll tell us the total number of volunteer hours donated to the agency, as well as those donated by low-income individuals specifically. And then number 3 on staff development and certification attainment. This was updated based on your concrete suggestions for additions. So as Barbara mentioned, we heard that there were some credentials missing related to weatherization, and you'll see that big red arrow is pointing to the addition of quality control inspectors, lead risk certified assessors. So we really appreciated that very helpful feedback. And then the last part of Section D is number 4 on partnerships. This was another recommendation that we received during the initial feedback period. We heard from you that you wanted the opportunity to report on partnerships, and you'll notice that this list is exactly the same as what's reported in 4.1 in the CSBGIS. And just to reiterate, you'll see a note at the bottom of the slide that you're reporting on partnerships that contribute to the agency's capacity. And then we're coming to the end of Module 2 with Section C, and you'll actually see that this is almost identical to what you're reporting in Section F in the CSBGIS. Since the initial feedback period, we have removed volunteer hours from this report. Now the only change or only difference to this reporting form is where you see reporting period at the top of the form. But otherwise, this will be very familiar to how you're reporting in Section F. And with that, I'll turn this over to Seth.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to walk through, and actually, as we looked at some of the questions we've been receiving so far, this part of the presentation may address, or may at least begin to address some of those questions. But what we wanted to do is just briefly review the annual report, sort of the phased-in reporting and how this is expected to work, and again, to get a better picture of that. This present slide shows the 4 modules, and when report would be the first submission of data to OCS or would take place. So Module 1, which is the State Administration module, for fiscal year 2016, the report would be due March of 2017. So just to kind of anchor this for everybody who's working in a state office, last September 1st, states submitted their 2016 state CSBG plan. In upcoming March of 2017, there will be a due date for an annual report based on that the same reporting period. So that's the cycle that will then begin to institutionalize every year. This year, in September, states will submit their 2017 annual report, and it would be due in March of 2018. Because of the modules 2, 3, and 4, all require both data from the local agencies, which requires both the time to prepare for the collection of the data, and there's a significant extra effort that's needed there. These are delayed. The first actual report that would come from the state would be March 31st of 2019 for modules 2, 3, and 4. But the data collection would begin in fiscal year 2018. So let me just share what that kind of means on a practical level for the community action agencies. That means there are, based on current practice and current reporting cycles, there are a small number of states, 6 states that we've identified based on current practice, that report from July to July. And so those states, based on current practice, would begin collecting the data, or need to begin the work of collecting data in July of 2017, or approximately a year from now. There are 30 states that, the bulk of states that operate on October 1st, beginning the collection of data. So October 1st of 2017 would be when they would begin to collect the data. And that cycle is close to what the federal fiscal year is, which is October 1st through September 30th. And then there are a number of states, and the smaller number, that report from January to January. They report on a calendar year. So for those states, they would begin to collect the data January 1st, 2018, and would report on that cycle. So that's how this works in terms of aligning with the current cycles. I believe that on the NASCSP website, there is a chart that you can search to see where your state fits in that framework. And so, again, that obviously has practical implications. Those that have the earlier cycle would have a much earlier date to begin collecting the data than others. And so we recognize that, and that's how this would work. Just to then talk a little bit about where we are in the one more review of where we are in the feedback and our input on the annual report. There are 3 steps in the input process that we've envisioned for the annual report. The first one, and we kind of just shared some of the NASCSP shared the initial feedback report period and what feedback was received in that. We are now in the 60-day OMB comment period, and this will be followed by a formal 30-day OMB comment period. So the initial feedback period has been completed, and working together, as we shared, we've compiled the survey data, modified the draft report, made some revisions in forms, and developed a variety of supplemental documents to help support the review for this round. The current status, as we shared, the Federal Register notice for the 60-day comment period began June 16th, 2016, and we will end the 60-day comment period August 15th of 2016. What I would just encourage, though, is if you have comments and are able to provide them sooner, we would certainly welcome them. We are going to be collecting and organizing all comments on a rolling basis and beginning and the analysis. So sooner is certainly going to be, as soon as you can provide is always welcomed, but the deadline for comment and the 60-day comment period runs through August 15th. We expect to begin the final 30-day comment period in September of 2016. Generally, that process is expected to take place this autumn. So now, let's see. Now Rae is going to talk with us about next steps and resources.
Thanks, Seth. So while we go ahead and start to organize ourselves to start taking questions and answers, I want to first encourage everyone to take this opportunity to start submitting questions if you have not already via the chat feature to all panelists. And while we start to sort those and organize them, I want to encourage everyone to be very aware of the resources that are available to you. We know this is a large amount of information. The packet may appear very daunting, and so the first step is going to be to go to the CSBG Dear Colleague letter, which really details the open comment period for this report and lays out sort of how to submit the comments, the process by which those comments should be submitted, and it also includes in the appendix at the bottom of the page the rationale for feedbacks and the kinds of modifications that have been made, the theory of change, which we're all very familiar with, as well as the full annual report packet in its PDF form. I want to be very clear that the OMB feedback is only going to be on these documents, only the FRN annual report packet. So the other tools and resources and documents that we're talking about and presenting to you are supplemental tools that are designed to guide you through this PDF packet. But if you feel that you want to comment on how helpful these additional tools are, those are not to be submitted to OMB. Those would come to NASCSP and to OCS in a different comment and feedback process. So that would be through the ROMA Next Generation 2016 Gmail, for example. These tools that I'll be talking about on the next slide are designed to help you really dive deep into the federal comment period notice and the information in that packet. So we have a bunch of webinar recordings that are available. This is the last one of our live webinars for this FRN1 comment period. On our website, we have what is the OMB comment process? What do we mean when we say OMB comment process and clearance? We have webinars walking you through the various modules, the changes that we've made between sort of that first release that NASCSP posted back in March till now. We have tools and resources that are available to you. We really encourage you to take a look at the Excel spreadsheets on our website for modules 2 through 4. It's difficult to convey in a PDF some of the interactive features that we're envisioning for this new reporting tool for you, and so our Excel spreadsheets are going to be a little bit more interactive and sort of provide a little bit more foundation for understanding sort of that back-end interaction and auto-population that we're really envisioning. So I do encourage you to take a look at those to get a sense of sort of where the information and data entry is actually going to be and where there will be pre-population or auto-summing, for example. Similarly, we have examples of state and national reports to sort of provide examples of how this data will be aggregated from the local to the state to the national level. For those who are intimately familiar with that collective impact tool that we proposed back in March, this has now been offered as a supplemental tool that local agencies can use to track their progress through a collective impact initiative, but it is not part of the official reporting packet, if you will. We also have a Mythbusters out. We've heard a lot of concerns and possible misconceptions over this time period, so we have a Mythbusters sort of demystifying some of these common concerns. And we also have a really great ROMA and ROMA Next Generation graphic that sort of expands on, in a really easy to access way, the connection between ROMA, that foundational cycle, as well as these newer pieces that we've been adding to really enhance the implementation of ROMA. We also have posters that you can download and print out if you're presenting this to maybe audiences that are less familiar with the nuances behind all of these conversations we've been having. And for the data geeks among you, we've also done a really deep dive into how the annual report crosswalks with the current CSBG IS. And we have that on a high level, just very, how the sections match with the modules, down to the how each indicator can be actually crosswalked from the IS into the annual report. And finally, we do have access to all of the tools and the feedback, like the feedback that Jackie mentioned during that initial feedback period. So if you want to, again, for the data geeks among you, if you want to really dive into what your peers and you have provided to us in that sort of initial feedback period, we do have your feedback in a qualitative report that you can access and see what everyone else has been saying in this last sort of initial comment period leading up to these modifications. Just a few helpful links on the slide in front of you. Again, this is the link to the Federal Register notice, a link to the Dear Colleague with the link to the actual annual report packet. Again, that is the only thing we will be formally commenting on in the OMB comment process. Again, we have information on what that means on our website, as well as all of those supplemental tools to support your review. Similarly, all of our webinars that we've held in the past few weeks are live and have been recorded, and those slides have been posted to our website along with the recording. And we expect that this presentation would be available after this, after we've finalized the Q&A, and it'll be live by Monday.
So we are going to go into question and answer in a moment, but I do want to take us, while we're looking at those links, I just wanted to say one further thing, which is, again, as Rae encouraged you to look and review the Dear Colleague message for the instructions with regard to providing comments, there's a specific web address in the Dear Colleague for providing those comments. But I want to also just encourage you, when we're going to be organizing and reviewing comments, we're going to be looking for questions and comments that relate to specific sections of the annual report, specific subsections, and question numbers. So the more you can organize your comments in such a way, if you have general comments that relate to things like burden, data capacity, overall input, those can certainly, we encourage you to provide those sort of perhaps in an opening section. And if you have questions that relate to a specific module and you can reference the module, that's very helpful to us. If you can reference the specific section, the title of the specific section that you're commenting on, if you have a specific question number, that's, again, very helpful. And if it's input, again, is it the right question? Is it a wording input or other things of that nature? But the more you can frame that, the easier it will be for us to be responsive. So just would like to, encourage you as you do this to try to organize your general comments perhaps first, followed by, input on specific modules and sections, and label that as much as possible, and that will help us to make sure we get at the right, where you are providing your input.
Great. So let's go into the question and answer section. I'm going to kind of moderate this in terms of reading the questions. We're sort of going by how they came in. And Seth will provide some answers. If anyone else wants to chime in, that's fine too. So let me start. We're going to start with Module 1 questions, since I know we got a handful of those, some good ones. So the first question, will all states, including the 12 who are doing the state plan for the first time, we were in the second year of an improved state plan last year, be required to do reporting in March of 2017?
Thanks. Yes, and yes, the answer is yes. And although we did not require a full state plan in the online data collection system for those states that had a 2-year plan, we did ask those states to respond to a series of questions. Generally, those are the questions that require plan versus actual type of response. These are the state accountability measure questions that were new information. So yes, states that were in the second year of a 2-year plan last year that only provided some updated information are expected to be part of the March 2017 annual report submission, at least in terms of the administrative module. What I will say, though, is we will work to do some, as we do testing of our system and as we look at how this is going to work, we think there might be some special or unique challenges for those particular states. We're going to have to test the auto-populate features, and depending on how much information was in the update, that may be a unique issue for some states. But we'll work with, try to include some states that were in that category in the testing, and hopefully that will help us identify any challenges or glitches. But generally, the information, and also if there is a question about whether information would be available, certainly you can provide that in the comment period. But these are generally, we do believe that the questions that we are responding to in the annual report are things that were update information that states were asked to provide, even if they were in the second year of a 2-year plan.
Second question also had to deal with kind of the calendar issues. I know this fiscal year stuff can get confusing. The question is, I need help visualizing the calendar of Module 1, the state plan. I am submitting in September 2016 the plan for periods fiscal year 17 and 18. Therefore, when I complete the annual report for March 2017, it will be for fiscal year 16. Is that correct?
It is correct. Now, and I will just say that this is we all, even those of us who've been in the federal government for 23 years, still find it challenging sometimes to navigate the language around the federal fiscal year. When federal fiscal year begins on October 1st and ends in September 30th. So plan that was submitted in September of 2015, September 1st, 2015, would be the fiscal year 2016 plan. And as I shared earlier, the cycle of reporting would be the plan is submitted in September of the 2015. The report would be in March for the same fiscal year, March of 2017, and that cycle would continue. It's just also really, it can be complicated to also, we sometimes look at the state plan and the annual report. And again, just there is going to be a lot of overlap in terms of the questions. There's a reason for that. These are planned versus actual, and the hope is that we're actually going to be, what was included in the plan is going to be populated into the annual report, and then simply what states will be doing is sort of filling out what actually, what actually occurred in terms of compared to what was reported in the plan.
Okay, some questions on some specific parts of Module 1. There's a question about on H6, which has to do with monitoring, corrective action, fiscal controls. What does audit number mean?
Yeah, and so H6 is a single audit review, and we would just highlight that we're looking for the reference number that would have been assigned by the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. This is just a tracking number. That's what and I think we will review that because I think that's the kind of comment in terms of clarity of question that we really welcome, because we certainly could understand why that might be confusing. So we're looking for a reference number, which would be what would be available for that particular audit. And what we will do, I mean, again, that's fine to provide the comment in the 60-day comment period, but we'll go back to look at question H6, and I think there may be other items where we're going to need to clarify there. But if that's to make sure that we are crystal clear in terms of what we want people to put in particular boxes.
Okay, next question. Are these not also questions, the ones that we're saying in the annual report, we will have to submit for Model State Plan Annual Report Update due 9/1/16?
Right. So I think this is, again, this is the, and we do this here on a regular basis as well. Sometimes when we talk, the terminology we want to make sure we're talking about is the state CSBG plan. That's due in September 1st of each year. The annual report is due in March of the following year for that same reporting period. And so, yes, many of the questions are the same. There are a number of sections in the state plan that that there is no reference to in the annual report. But many of the questions are, yes, the same types of questions, follow-through questions. But again, there is a reason for that. We're talking about planned expenditures and planned activities. That's what's provided in September. The following year in March, we're talking about what actually happened, and again, so that we can, it's a part of the accountability cycle we're looking to make sure happens here.
Next question, still about Module 1. Is the expectation that all eligible entities that do not meet all organizational standards will be either on a TAP or a QUIP, or is this a baseline year with some leniency?
The general expectation is that when an entity is not meeting the organizational standards, that there will be a plan to help that agency and move toward meeting the standards. And in some cases, that may take some time, but the general expectation is that there would be a technical assistance plan put in place for the entities. The question, as asked in the administrative module, does provide an opportunity that if there were entities that were not on a QIP or TAP, there can be some explanation of that. So it's not that that this is. It is the general expectation is that we are looking to make sure that if there is a standard that needs to be addressed, that at minimum there is a plan of technical assistance to help them meet that. So again, this is not intended as a punitive thing. Having a technical assistance plan is not intended to be a negative. It's just that we would want to see that, and if not, have an explanation. And the goal again is to be creating a cycle of technical assistance and support to help everybody meet these standards.
Next question. What data analysis tools will be used by states and the eligible entities? Will there be resources to integrate data systems?
I think this is an important question, and really when we get down, for example, to the question about B7, and we were talking about analysis, some of this is going to be dependent on the capacity to do analysis, both at the local agency level and at the state level. There may be some additional tools that we can work through to provide, at least to help in rolling up or analyzing data from a technical assistance perspective. There is different capacity currently among the local agencies. There are some that have robust information systems. Some of that still, again, may be challenging to incorporate new information into it, but the general, we recognize this is a major area of need and support. It's sort of the fundamental of how we're going to be able to deliver upon this ROMA system and make sure that robust analysis capacity is available at the local agency level and the state level. We don't necessarily envision one set of tools that will be implemented nationwide. We know there are different data systems already in place in many states. And again, we know this is an area that we expect to get more input during the 60-day period, and that we know is going to be, over the course of a couple of years here, is going to be an area we're going to be looking at in terms of support that can be provided at the federal level, what states can do utilizing discretionary resources, and again, what local agencies can do and what will be within their existing data systems and information systems. So this is a big question, and one that we know is going to require a lot of ongoing work and input.
So the next question about Module 1 has to do with E2, and E2 is, sorry, I just lost my page. E2 is plan versus actual allocation. It's part of the state use of funds. The question is, our state's contracts for 2016 actually do not close until the last day of March, which is when the annual report is due. Therefore, we will not have final obligation and carryover figures until a week or so into April 2017. Will it be possible to submit an amended annual report during April if we need to adjust our amounts?
I think this is a great question. What I appreciate about this question is that someone is really obviously delving in to think about the mechanics of answering that question, and we really need to get your input there. I would say there might be a distinction to be made between what we're asking for in terms of actual allocations and obligations as opposed to liquidation of expenditures. And I would talk about, and we may, this may be a place we want to provide additional guidance on our expectations here. And because we're looking at kind of a point in time situation. March is when we're currently expecting to have the reports, but contract obligations may also be, you may be able to indicate how much has been obligated and committed into contracts in different areas of technical assistance without having to be tied to a dollar liquidation figure. And so we want to have what's feasible and available in March of the following year, but we're going to need to, that's something to look at, and we will look at options for how to make sure this is provided in a way that we get the best possible information. It would probably not be a major thing if it was a week later, but the issue is, we want to have a kind of consistent point in time when we get the annual report from states. So we will look at this, but and it's an excellent question. The main thing we had envisioned was not necessarily that we were looking for the every dollar that had been liquidated by the state, as much as how much was obligated to the major categories, as and that would mean what was committed in contracts or committed in other funding mechanisms, and how much was allocated specifically and committed to the eligible entities, as opposed to perhaps the liquidation, which is the actual vouchers paid.
Before we turn to Module 2, I see one more question that just came in on Module 1. Let's see if we can answer that one. Did you say B7, Section B7 of Module 1 would be delayed for reporting out in March 2017?
So, I think the thinking here is that that's the analysis, a roll-up of analysis. So it's dependent in many respects on the data that's in Modules 2, 3, and 4 to be able to answer that in a meaningful way. There may be, there are some things that so the thought is that we could delay that section and allow, additional support and make sure that we've built the capacity to do that, to answer that in a meaningful way. There are a couple of things that are in B7, like changes to the eligible entities and so forth, that kind of executive summary type of information. But generally, yes, we're looking to say that that would be something that we think would need more support, need more capacity, and would be delayed. It would depend on the availability of the data in the other modules.
Okay. Hopefully that's been helpful. Thank you, Seth. Let's go to Module 2, and I know some NASCSP staff has some answers helpful here. So one of the questions is, where will the family developed credential be reported in Module 2, Section B? Who wants to take that?
So, as you can see from the changes just between the initial feedback period and the current format of the form, we are adding credentials based on concrete feedback, and we also have an other section. So that is the kind of comment we definitely would encourage you to include in a formal comment to OMB, either as a suggestion for adding, or you can simply add it under other in that form.
Another question, please clarify what amount should be listed in the new Module 2, Section C, previously Section F. We were told at one time to only list the funds allocated to us in the fiscal year, but CAs do not believe that this tells the full story. They feel they should be reporting what they expended during the fiscal year.
So as Lauren and Jackie mentioned, Module 2, Section E is basically identical to Section F, and so the language for allocated has remained unchanged. That being said, if you feel strongly that this should be changed to expended during the fiscal year, we again encourage you to put that into a comment, and we are open to that suggestion since that section has remained virtually identical to the current CSBGIS.
Another question, our state CSBG office and state association plans to hold a discussion on the proposed CSBG annual report with the CAs in our state. Is there a discussion guide or outline that has already been created that we can use to guide the discussion?
That's a good question. This is Lauren. We are working on specific discussion guides for Module 3 and Module 4 as of right now. But in the meantime, up until we post those discussion guides, there are those other supplemental tools that are posted on our website. And I do think that those will be helpful in guiding your discussions as well. For example, the ROMA Next Generation cycle graphic, or some of the other crosswalks that are posted.
I think our final question, we have a couple we probably aren't going to get to, but we will post. But someone did ask, can you provide the link to download the slides for the 2 prior webinars, the June 29th and July 6th? Why don't you just give your NASCSP site again?
Sure, that's been shared in the chat window, and you can also find that via the ROMA resources button on the main page of the NASCSP website.
Yep, and it's also that last link listed on the helpful link slide.
So essentially you need to go to the NASCSP website.
Right.
All right, we want to end on time. It is now 3:30. We very much appreciate the attention that you've given us and the good questions. We will post these questions along with the webinar in the next couple of days. So thank you very much. Have a good weekend.